Thank you for joining. It was said already this morning that there is no cell and gene therapy, no ATMP meeting without a discussion on hospital exemption. I think there is no cell and gene therapy meeting without a discussion on the fantastic value, the curative, change-lifing value that our products can deliver to patients, and the challenges of providing patients access to those products. Early on, with still limited evidence, but a growing risk-benefit positive assessment, through clinical trials, and then on the market. And it starts also on the regulatory approach to validate that use earlier on through clinical trials and then on the market within a complex but functioning European regulatory system. There's also no meeting, cell and gene therapy meeting, without a discussion of that evolution. And the meeting on the med, really, this year is particularly relevant because we are just about to see what we have picked already a little bit in terms of what could be the change of legislation and how is that going to go forward in the past context. All that said, we go on to the topic of the day, which is really discussing the hospital exemption. I've got a group of people, Paschalia and is actually on the phone at a distance enjoying the equally good weather of Greece, if I'm correct. But I've got here Chris and Gonzalo. I will let them introduce themselves. You can see there, or you could have seen the affiliation. I'll repeat. Gonzalo is head of clinical pharmacology department and coordinator of the Advanced Therapies Hospital Clinic of Barcelona. So you didn't travel far, but Thank you for coming.
Welcome.
Christopher Vann is senior vice president and chief operating officer of Autolus Therapeutics, and it does have a bit of previous regulatory focus, so I think that's a relevant discussion. And clearly, Paschalia Koufokotsiou, if I did say it well, I said it quickly so that it sounded good, is a policy officer of Pharmaceutical and Health Policy, DG SANTE of the European Commission. I'll introduce myself as well.
Thank you.
CEO of Kiji Therapeutics and a board member of Pharm, and also a former regulator, part of the European agency at a certain point. So I'll go back, I'll ask them to introduce themselves and to make an initial statement on hospital exemption covering 3 points. What is the past of hospital exemption? Why was it established? And what was the intention of hospital exemption at the time? How did we see it being deployed? And what were the challenges and benefits that we saw through the use of hospital exemption? And to the extent that we can either say, even if we know, or anticipate if we don't know, what is going to be the future of hospital exemption within the context of the legislation. And for some of us, it may be kind of wishful thinking, or how do we think it should be? But that should set the stage for past, present, and future of hospital exemption in the context of patient access, clinical development, and regulatory approval of ATMP products in Europe. Then I'll open up the discussion to the audience and have some questions. And I do have a few also topics that we've discussed before that could be covered. But I think that should give us a good entry. And I'll probably start with ladies first, Paschalia, and let you introduce yourself and comment on the 3 points that I mentioned to you. So over to you, Paschalia.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. So first of all, just 2 words about me. I am a policy officer for ATMPs within the European Commission, DG SANTE, and have been involved in the revision of the pharma legislation, including the revision of the so-called hospital exemption provision. I also follow the meetings of the CAT committee, the Committee for the Evaluation of the Marketing Authorization Application for ATMPs. Now, on the 3 points, I would like to start with the first point. What was the initial rationale to establish the hospital exemption? Actually, this is quite a challenging question because you can't find in the text very straightforward recital for the hospital exemption that describes completely the rationale. I just want to put into context what is it about, that Article 28 of the ATMP regulation, which introduced this hospital exemption, is based on 2 assumptions. First, it refers to ATMPs, so it should be medicines that fall under the definition of ATMPs. And second, that these products should be appropriate to be eligible to be covered from the hospital exemption. And it is about an exemption from the obligation from the mandatory central authorization, marketing authorization pathway. But the first is a real matter of classification. So while the hospital exemption remains a national competence, it's not under the remit of national competent authorities to make this classification decision. This is something that the Committee of the European Medicine Agency is doing after receiving an application. We can safely argue, however, that the initial purpose of Article 28 was to regulate ATMPs that were developed in clinical practice and were not intended to enter the market. Also, we can say that these ATMPs developed in hospital settings, the main purpose was to cover unmet medical needs. So it was, even at the time of the introduction of the ATMP regulation, foreseen that the pharmaceuticals company will not develop ATMPs that will cover all medical needs. Introducing a regulatory frame, it's about introducing a regulatory flexibility, and this is always a means to balance what is good to cover a patient need and also to protect the patient safety. Now, to which extent this has been achieved, I will go to comment the second point. What is the experience gained? We know that there are several studies. We can see several studies in the literature about the implementation of the hospital exemption. We recently organized also in DG SANTE some meetings with representatives from the academia and the industry in order to discuss about this experience. But overall, I think it is largely unknown what is the implementation of the hospital exemption across EU member states. Of course, it is obvious, everybody agrees that there is a huge divergence of national hospital exemption rules, and also the outcomes of the hospital exemption implementation in terms of how many are the holders of this hospital exemption approval or authorization. There was no actually in the legislation a specific concept. It's something that we try now to define with the revision of the pharma legislation. So we can see that the hospital exemption may be used as compassionate use of ATMPs, but also it can be a kind of national authorization pathway. And since you organized the event in Spain, this is the case in Spain, where the hospital exemption is granted after strict rules of evidence on safety and efficacy obtained by clinical trials. But then there are no real limitations for the number of patients, which was the initial description of Article 28. Now, for the third point, what the Commission? Apparently, this debate has lasted for years for the regulatory purpose of the hospital exemption, and already by organizing these two recent meetings with representatives of the academia and then the pharmaceutical industry, we realized that the views are conflicting. There is no agreement. Especially, there are some points that they are very critical, whether hospital exemption products should be allowed to be administered to patients when there is a centrally authorized ATMP available, or for the number of patients. Also, for the harmonization of the hospital exemption rules, everybody agrees that harmonization is a positive thing, but there are also some questions whether this harmonization will impair the access to ATMPs, of patients to ATMPs, or it will lead to setting up an alternative pathway. And if that would be the case, how this alternative pathway will sit in comparison with two standard regulatory pathways that we have in EU legislation, which is one, the regulatory pathway for clinical trials, and second, the central marketing authorization. Now, with the revision of the pharma legislation, we don't really make radical changes. The hospital exemption remains an exemption, so it is not, we don't change this concept. This, let's say, ambiguous terminology of Article 28 remains about the non-routine basis. We don't give a definition about this, but we introduced the concept of the approval of a hospital exemption by the national competent authorities. We introduced the obligation to notify these approvals to the European Medicine Agency, and also we make a straightforward obligation, the compliance with the GMPs that are equivalent to the GMP for ATMPs. And also we have the obligation, at least annual, that the national competent authority will collect data on safety, quality, safety and efficacy, and transmit this data to the European Medicine Agency. That is the main provisions of the hospital exemption. And in addition to that, we foresee an empowerment for the Commission for an implementing act to provide more details, because as I said, the ambiguity remains in the introduction of the article, so we have foreseen this implementing act to make it more detailed. Another thing that we are planning to do, and it's already ongoing, is this study that we will do on hospital exemption, on the implementation, because we really, as I said, the implementation, the experience is largely unknown, because there was no a standard mechanism to collect the data on the implementation of the hospital exemption. So we want really to map and engage the national competent authorities and all stakeholders involved in the implementation of the hospital exemption, but to map, of course, how Article 28 of the ATMP regulation has been transposed into national law, but we want to really dig a bit further and know, for example, for what therapeutic indications these hospital exemption products are developed, how many the number of patients that have access to these products, or whether the hospital exemption products continue to be administered, to be used to patients when there are, for the same therapeutic indication, under either a clinical trial ongoing or a centrally authorized ATMP. So I will stop for now, and I will be here for further questions or comments. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for a clear layout, and I knew I could count on you to do that. I picked up a few things, but I'll let my colleagues know. Gonzalo, the same three topics with a slightly different perspective, your own perspective, and the great example that we could potentially take from what you've done to really help us see through the future of that implementation.
Okay, so I can make a copy-paste of what she has said, but I will try to be a little bit more original, and not more than you, but not copying. Miguel has mentioned that I am the head of the clinical pharmacology department. That's true. That I am the coordinator of advanced therapies in the hospital. That essentially means nothing. Because you know better than me that physicians are quite reluctant to be coordinated by anyone. So I do my best to put some order, but it's very difficult. And another important task is that I have, that is really heading the regulatory team in the clinical pharmacology department, dealing with regulatory bodies at the national level and at an European level. My life, by chance, has been extremely linked. I never was looking for working with advanced therapies, but the chance put them in my road. I was the first rapporteur in Europe for a gene therapy medicinal product. That was Cerebro, that was failing, was also a very early clinical development. I was involved at the CHMP level in the discussion of the regulation on advanced therapies. And now I'm in my hospital because of my past time as regulator to be dealing with regulatory issues for the hospital products. Currently, just one. And I think that we need to put in perspective, after the previous speaker has mentioned, what is the real impact of exemption, hospital exemption. I mean, the discussion in 2007, 2006, when we were discussing the new regulation on advanced therapies, the Spanish government was scared. And I think that Spain was one of the most active member states in order to introduce the concept of medical exemption. I don't know if we were the only one or there were more, more countries. The reason was because we have a Ministry of Health that was an expert in cell therapy. And there was even a general directorate of cell therapy in the Ministry of Health in Spain. But the most important is that was a very wide research tissue in cell therapy in Spain. Gene therapy was, at that time, not so present. So there was some pressure from some countries to establish this clause, allowing not to stop dramatically any initiative coming from the academia and allow them some local development. But don't get panic for those that may get panic with that. I mean, we are in the 9th year of the Spanish legislation hospital exemption, and we have 2 products with hospital exemption. It's not that there is a massive upcoming to the market of 100 of advanced therapies. We have one cell therapy for medullary lesions, and we have the one CD19 CAR-T, that is what we have developed for the treatment of adult older than 25 patients with acute lymphocytic leukemia. But I mean, this is a way to facilitate the access, and in that case, when we submitted, still there was no option available, so it was covering an unmet medical need. But we understand that hospital exemption is not the right way to solve the access of patients, unless there is a big European network. I mean, hospital clinics by itself, probably with LLA, because the number of patients are not so high, but we have not the facilities and the capabilities to cover the whole European market. In that case, it's a personal, and not personal referring to me, personal of the hospital, is a challenge. And we have decided to demonstrate, or to try to demonstrate, that an academic initiative is not poorer in terms of quality, efficacy, and safety than industrial initiatives. And that is the reason why we have gone to the EMA. We got the prime, and we have tried to demonstrate to the European Society that the rules that have been applied at the Spanish level are comparable to that, or to those that apply at the European Medicines Agency at an European level. In fact, the European Medicines is the sum of different agencies. But we cannot do that for a number of cards that we have under the research. I mean, hospital clinic is not a pharmaceutical industry. So we perfectly understand that we have a very good basic research, that we have the capabilities and the clinical expertise in order to do initial clinical development, but in order to get further, I mean, we don't have the money, we don't have the tools, and we are perfectly willing to partnering with any associate other academic centers, pharmaceutical industry. What we would like is to get the right to put on the table some conditions. I mean, the main problem, if you look at the, let's say, CAR-Ts, but maybe, I mean, there are a number of CAR-T cells approved, but if you map the real access across Europe, it's very low. Public health system cannot pay this amount of money. So we are perfectly willing to tell companies, okay, we have the idea, we can try, we can limit your chance to fail, because we will be willing to make the initial clinical trials, and then we collaborate under the condition that since we have got the early risk, the final price has to be adapted to something that is really accessible. But we are not aiming at doing any revolution. We are not aiming to fight the pharmaceutical industry. We will be loser in that case. But we need to try to put on the table another model that is possible, that may be convenient for the pharmaceutical industry, because one of the biggest problems for the pharmaceutical industry is the likelihood to fail in a clinical development and in early or later stage. So this part we can do. And then getting any kind of partnering with pharmaceutical industry or with other European institutions. But the main outcome is not to get money that make the richest hospital in Europe. We are not getting that money for the time being, but just to really make therapies accessible for patients. And I think this is a fair objective, even for pharmaceutical industry, because it is completely useless that you put drugs in the market theoretically approved by the European Medicines Agency, but at the end you fail to put in the real market because the government decided that there is no money for paying that. So I think it's important just to rethink what the policy about these extremely expensive therapies, these extremely sometimes effective therapies, how between all of us together make an exercise to rethink a little bit the strategy so that it is less risky for companies. We can develop that with some public funding or private funding, and then once we have passed the highest level of risk at the very beginning of development, we discuss with companies how to put that in the market. And I think this is something that can be waiting in the future. Otherwise, please, all in the audience, understand that we are not a pharmaceutical company, and this is not the intention. I know that there are many people saying, no, hospital exemption will be the definite way to get patients access to it. I don't think this is the reality. I think it's an intermediate step. Otherwise, you will have got only a very, very small objective rather than the big objective.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I think you raised a series of topics. I'm sure Chris will pick it up on that. I think it's also important to understand that, yes, there's a lot of opinions and discussion. It's also important to have a few anchors in terms of quality, regulatory approval, and the roles of research, translation, and commercialization that different players bring. And all of that leads to two things that will be important, is patient access, health, not only of the patient, but also health of the sector, and the ability of innovation and competition. But, I mean, maybe, Chris, you want to...
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for actually... I was thinking about a different angle to approach this, and with any new legislation, it's important to understand context. It's also important to understand what the objectives are, and I think what everyone in the room and what we all believe in is we want access to European patients to the most innovative medicines. Now, in order to achieve that, we have to find solutions, and we all need a very strong academic sector, and we also need the big companies and companies like myself to bring new products forward, but also to scale to be able to deliver that type of treatment to a very large number of patients. Particularly, we've already started crossing into areas like second-line DLBCL, multiple myeloma, which will require industrial scale delivery. So if you look at it in that context, that we start from the same starting point, that we want patient access, we want strong academia, and we also want Europe to benefit from a vibrant industry, both exports, but also for job creation and other things, will then put the hospital exemption into that framework. So my understanding initially for hospital exemption was it was for individual patient use in exceptional circumstances where the patient could not gain access to a product via another means, and there is not anyone in the room who should be against that. That's what we all want, and at the end of the day is individual patients to benefit from treatment. Where we are in the moment, you can look at this half empty, half full. I actually rather take the opportunity that this is a good opportunity to reset and clarify the rules around hospital exemptions, because it has been nationally administered. There are different standards. There are different objectives for hospital exemptions. But where we are at the moment is clearly there are different standards applied on a national level. And we've also begun to kind of move into the grey area of what I would call decentralized commercial manufacture, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we should be clear that that's essentially where we have found ourselves, that there's an alternative supply, if you like, of a product that's centrally authorized and available commercially. So we're kind of getting into an area where there's an alternative method of supply for patients, which may not have a commercial basis, but is actually getting into the area where commercial supply is possible from a centralized or other form that's regulated. Where I hope we go to is hospital exemption has an absolute core need, which is to get access to patients who otherwise would not have access. It has a core value as well in stimulating academic research. What I hope we will move to, though, is consistent regulatory standards which are applied rigorously for products once a central manufacture is in place, once a marketing authorization is in place, because I think it's really important to drive innovation, to have consistent standards, and to actually have people competing from a commercial perspective or from a competitive position on an equal playing field. So I actually, by the way, believe that decentralized manufacturing may come, particularly for the very small and the very big indications. Actually, we can discuss why. I think it's a very valid approach, but I think that there should be similar stringency and similar levels of hurdle in order for there to be a drive both for innovation but also for effective management of quality and safety for patients.
Thank you, Chris. Just a quick loop on the decentralized manufacturing, because I think people need to understand that hospital exemption is not decentralized manufacturing, and decentralized manufacturing does not mean hospital exemption. Decentralized manufacturing means doing it in different locations close to the patients under the same approval, same criteria, same standard, same release.
Point of care strategy.
So, and I think that's going to go, right? I was talking with someone the other day saying, like, we're going to start doing, 3D printing for some things at home, I think, but it's actually under a certain guidance and certain criteria, the same thing will happen. So it's different. It's kind of a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach, which is probably what hospital exemption is, because it starts on the local need and the local experience. I'll take one thing back. I mean, there were a few things that we all said. Well, I didn't. I was just kind of listening. But it was on an exceptional basis. It was for one or few patients for an unmet medical need with a risk-benefit assessment. It has been implemented in different ways. And interestingly enough, we don't even know exactly how it has been deployed and implemented. In other words, there is diversity of implementation and lack of full knowledge of the consequences and the aspect of that implementation. But going forward, it's interesting that the Commission has assumed we're keeping the hospital exemption, but then we're going to make a series of precisions, definitions. In other words, bringing it under, I would call it, I mean, it's a strong word, under control, but not creating, and I hope that is clear as well, a parallel regulatory track, because that would not be of benefit for nobody, really, I don't think.
It's a short comment, because I would be...
I was going to give the audience, but
no.
You're up here.
But you are guilty of my reaction. I want to get you informed. I mean, the standards are not different. We are manufacturing GMP. We are inspected yearly, and we are inspected every time for every single clinical trial we initiate with a new therapy. Inspections from the Spanish agency in terms of GMP are extremely hard, and sometimes they have denied in the first round the manufacturing. So we are paying a similar price. Of course, we have just one small manufacturing site, and our manufacturing capacity is limited. Second, we got conditional approval, and we were obliged to conduct an additional clinical study that is ongoing. So this is not essentially different. We are absolutely obliged to be compliant with GCPs. And if we go to the EMA, I'm sure we'll got a GCP inspection, just for the sake of safety for the EMA side. And we are obliged to put in place a risk management plan, and we are reporting currently every 6 months with updated benefit risk, with all the scientific information, PSUR, and so on to the agency. So the obligations are not that different. The main difference is that we are dealing with a limited number of patients, because it's not a common indication just in a country, we can deal with that. But I want to make clear that the standards are not different, and now we have gone for the prime, we have undertaken scientific advice with the EMA. The EMA has made the comments, and we need to readapt. But the second is that I don't think that the point of care is essentially linked to the idea. In my hospital, we are very eager to discuss everything, even to discuss useless topics. and one of the topics that we have discussed is the point of care, because we think, but as I have said to you, physicians, and I'm a physician, I'm as difficult as all of us we are. I mean, they are sometimes rather utopic in the idea that we can establish a public academic network of advanced therapies, and we can create a mega consortium. This is a mess. I mean, we will need pharmaceutical industry in most of the circumstances. Maybe for a very specific rare disease, you can handle the development of an advanced therapy. But for multiple myeloma, you can do a clinical trial, but at the time of going to the market, you need a partner. This is for sure. But many partners, industrial, are now thinking about the point of care. And the point of care is wishful thinking to me. I mean, it's okay, it's nice to know, but you will have to get inspected as many manufacturing sites that you are proposing 22 manufacturing sites or one manufacturing site in a hospital in Europe. Okay, you will get 27 inspections. You need to run 27 comparability studies. It's not, life is not for free. Life is expensive. And this is something that needs to be fought.
Yeah, and I think, Gonzalo, there's two things. One is obviously the quality, the criteria, the standards, and the other one is where they are submitted and approved in terms of which regulatory process. And you actually just said it in terms of complying with all those standards, but then bringing them up or down or wherever, or laterally to the European agency in terms of the main regulatory stream. right? So that's, I mean, a parallel regulatory track does not mean necessarily different standards, right? It means a parallel to an existing system. And so why do we have a parallel if we have the one? But at the same time, I agree with you, we've got to make absolutely sure for the patient's safety that there is the same standards, except, I would say, in very exceptional circumstances where the risk-benefit is assessed, as I said. That's why the compassionate use and the exceptional. I'll probably just stop there for us in a minute and ask if there's any questions from the audience before we go to potentially other topics. So I think there's a cube that can go round. Yes?
Yes, good morning. I have a question.
Yeah, we cannot hear you.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Isabel Hoche from Allovir. I have a question for you. You know, once you've got...
For whom?
For you.
Oh.
In your hospital, and it was linked to what Miguel said related to the safety of patient and more or less the long-term follow-up of patient. You know, you treat your patient, it's okay, everything is okay. How are you going to follow him on a long-term perspective?
By
what
law?
are your obligations? Do you have to put them in registry?
No, by law, 15 years.
Okay. So,
but if they are lucky to survive, yeah. But 15 years.
Hope that we will be in this positive situation, yeah. But when you look at CAR-T approved currently, the long-term follow-up that they have to put in place is much longer than 15 years. So how will we fill this gap?
But I mean, if you have a patient with lymphocytic acute leukemia, that is the only one that we have approved, if the patient is not cured, yeah. He will not live for 15 years, for sure. If the patient is cured, okay, he's cured, and then is one control every year.
But you enroll your patient in registry, you have the obligation?
Yeah, we have the obligation of register, and we have the obligation to, every 6 months, report all the data to the Spanish agency. All, safety and efficacy. And Miguel, one of the reasons, because the people were not putting in question that there were 2 regulatory standards. But they say that the Spanish agency was exceptionally banning or generous when assessing. And this is what made us react. We will put the dossier at the EMA and we will discuss if it was a matter of the Spanish agency or if the European Medicines Agency is one of the reasons, yes, to react to those people that, wow, this is something internal in Spain. No. The quality is there. We may get a positive or negative opinion, but the assessment report will be made publicly available.
And that's exactly what I meant in terms of getting a single regulatory path and no exceptional, no parallel regulatory tracks. Understanding, nevertheless, the European Commission intention of keeping the exception. And I think the exception has served some patients well in terms of unmet medical need. And Chris said it, and you also said it. There are circumstances where that exceptional use is needed for an unmet medical need with no alternative and with some evidence and a good quality basis for the product that enables to give an option to that patient. The question is interesting is that what do we do with the data from that option afterwards if it is part of a collaboration that then leads to a translation into academia, hospital, and then industry translation and the commercialization, the path that you've highlighted, which is actually the path that we should support, or if it doesn't and stays there, but if it's competing with clinical trial or alternative paths. And we'll come back to that, unless if there's any other questions from the audience. Yes, there's another question there.
Building on the discussion and also towards Gonzalo. So, and I'm simplifying it, you've got a Spanish label now, you're going to go for a European label. Nice. How are you going to address the fact that even with a different label, you're only going to target your specific patient population in Spain. Because to me, that's a part of the hospital exemption that has not been discussed, is I don't see an urgency or a drive to scale it out to other European countries, to the rest of the patient population. In my opinion, hospital exemption continues to stay a local initiative regardless of what quality regulatory standards it adheres to. And that, for me, looking at the patient, is a big miss of hospital exemption. So my question is, are there any plans to then also collaborate, and I know it's not possible to do it with 27 centers across Europe, but in some way to scale it up to the rest of the European patient population?
Can I just, I mean, Matthew did it in this morning as well, so I think I can do it as well. It's just kind of reposition. Your point is very, very relevant on multiple ways in terms of also ensuring that there is no patients at disadvantage in different countries. I take it. And that's also why the exemption needs to be contained, but the regulatory path is a pan-European one. And that's what they actually, in a way, are doing. So.
Yeah, no, to me it's a little bit surprising, the question, very intelligent but surprising. I mean, one can complain that we have used the hospital exemption because the path, but what is the problem if we follow the regular route with the same rules that any other marketing authorization holder? I mean, we are not asking to be treated differently by anyone. And of course, we want to limit the conditions of use to the requested indication that at this point in time is LLA of adults. Because for children, Kymriah have the market exclusivity because they got the consolidated approval. Another thing is for those products that still have the conditional approval. So theoretically, we could aim to reach other European citizens. I think that if we understand the European Union and it should be, yes, and we are legitimate to do that. We have the power to do that. Not for the time being. Not for the time being. We can try to do an European clinical trial with the collaboration of academic centers. Yes, because a clinical trial has a limited sample size. But in the long run, we cannot do alone. We cannot do alone.
Maybe, Pascal, do you want to take this comment about the cross-border and the hospital exemption? Do you want to make any comment, Paschalia?
Yes, I would like to make two comments. First, indeed, there is an issue of migration of patients when there is such a divergence of hospital exemption rules, especially regarding the critical issue of how many patients are eligible to have access. Although Article 28 speaks only for an individual patient, but this is not the case in how hospital exemption is implemented. Regarding the exchange of knowledge between ATMP developers in hospital settings, it will be one of the topics that we will try to clarify with the implementing act that we have foreseen in this revised pharma legislation, because we understood from the discussion that it is very important to have some exchange of knowledge and experience between those involved in the implementation of the hospital exemption. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think the first really important thing, and you should read the paper from the Spanish group if you're not aware of it. It's a very interesting position paper. We should all support hospital exemption as a means to get access to patients. It also stimulates research. I think the key issues are that if you are actually going to be providing a product where one already is available commercially, there should be consistent standards. And I think that, you know, I don't see a competition here, and I think we've got to be very careful. Autolus has spun out of UCL. We actually have an academic base. We work together to find a solution for the patients. I think we need to do that here. I think the key issue, as you say, is a level playing field, consistent levels of regulatory control, follow-up, release of the product. Those should be consistent, irrespective of the means by which a patient receives the treatment once a commercial product's on the market.
Yeah. Well, the fact that the paper is written by Spanish authors, that not mean necessarily that I agree with all the points. In fact, I disagree with some of them.
Okay.
But Paschalia has mentioned the need to decide patient by patient. And in Spain, this is the rule, not only for all CAR-T cell therapy, but for all of them. There is a group of experts, and every individual request for treating a patient, either with lymphoma or with leukemia, are discussed individually. And our product is not an exception. It is approved case by case.
You mentioned, several things that will come on the legislation, because I wanted us to, as we approach the end, start to give a perspective of how should we move this forward from our different angles, right? We all, at least I'm saying it, we have the patient at the heart of this in terms of providing patient access, be it in exceptional circumstances or tendentially on larger, even transnational perspectives. The collaboration between academia and investigator centers and industry is essential on that scaling up of access that we need to see. And it's actually very fructuous, and it's important for the competitiveness of Europe. You've mentioned going forward that there will be no radical changes. A hospital exemption will remain, and I took a few notes, and I would like us to reflect on that, on a non-routine basis as an exemption, on an approval by the competent authorities, with a notification to EMA and a GMP, collect information as an obligation for the competent authorities to bring it together. So again, addressing some of the challenges that we've seen before, and monitor the implementation and the use going forward with recommendations to consider how it would be then further implemented. I'll just stop there and see if the audience has got any other comments, because then I would like, with comments or questions, for us here to come back on this perspective and see how does it address the challenges and the need for an hospital exemption, how it addresses the potential concern about access, how it prevents or not a competition, namely to clinical trials or to commercial products, and how in the end is really benefiting what we all strive for, which is patient access to address their unmet medical needs, either on exceptional circumstances or in a broad circumstance. So, audience, any questions or comments? Yes. The box to the middle.
Are you ready?
Thank you.
Hello.
All right.
Thank you for the great discussion. I have two questions, and mainly to Gonzalo. First, what are the costs of your hospital exemption product, would say CAR-T product? And the second, can you imagine that you use the hospital exception because the originally approved product is withdrawn from the European market due to reimbursement issues?
Yes, I understand what your position, but I didn't create the hospital exemption figure. And it is supposed to come from the academia, not from pharmaceutical industry. But yes, I think, and I would like to take the huge opportunity that Paschalia is present, that I think, because there are many uncertainties. I mean, There are some in national regulations. There is no European common understanding of what, and I understand what is the expectancy from industry, what is the expectancy, sometimes non-realistic from the academy, the regulatory position that is not comfortable all the time. And I think that the European Commission, and it's not a plea, it's just a suggestion, could organize a forum for discussion formed by academia from different countries, from pharmaceutical companies, from local regulators and local governments, and also from the European Commission and the EMA, and try to build up a common understanding of what does it mean, what are the limits, what cannot be exceeded with an hospital extension, which models of partnering, which is the model to use hospital extension to make new drugs more accessible to the patients without create a competition between industry and academy. This may be an artificial war, but this is not realistic. We don't have the means. And we are here discussing, we are expressing opinion, but the only leading institution, sorry, Paschalia, that we have in Europe is the European Commission, and you have the power to try.
But we did that. We have done this. We have done this discussion with representatives of academia
you invited
and
the wrong
industry.
persons.
Yeah. I think you did, and I was actually a part of that in terms of assessing and consulting. I think what Gonzalo is doing, and I think it's an interesting suggestion, is as you're monitoring the evolution going forward, part of the process, you may get the stakeholders involved on that monitoring process in terms of discussing it and finding the issues and opportunities with it. That's, I believe, what you're kind of suggesting.
Yeah, but I mean, there are many conversations that are failing conversations, but it does not mean that you need to stop the discussions. And maybe there is a need to rethink what is a situation that is not sustainable. I mean, even for the convergence of different European countries, is that there are areas of Europe that they have no idea what hospital exemption is. There are other regions like Spain that apparently we have two products, but apparently we are in the front line. But it's not that easy to create a position paper agreed by, with the main lines at least, agreed, organized by the European Commission and agreed by regulators, by industry, by academy. And I think it should not be, maybe, possibly as every time in my life I am wrong. But I think it is worth to try.
I know physicians are difficult to control. Thank you for that. Paschalia, can you give some final words in terms of going to the future, in terms of the hospital exemption? And I'll get Chris to finish and then I'll close. Any comments, any recommendations, any wishes from you? It's difficult to put you on that spot, but any comments, Paschalia?
Well, you know that I cannot represent my personal views in these panels. And for me, this the most challenging thing to achieve is to find consensus between the academia and the industry. From my experience for the two recent meetings that we had with representatives, I didn't see so much of overlapping in the positions. Especially there are critical topics, critical points that there is the views are quite opposite. For example, the access, the number of patients that will be eligible to have access. So while industry has a very clear position that when there is a clinical trial or when there is a centrally authorized ATMP, then they shouldn't allow hospital exemption products to be used to patients. The academia says, but when I have all the evidence on the safety and the efficacy, what is the scientific basis for refusing? And there is also an ethical question to this. So that would be interesting to really find common position between the main stakeholders. That would give a fair solution if we achieve this, to instead to have completely on the opposite sides, to try to converge, to find common points.
Thank you, Paschalia. Chris?
So I think we start with some common points, and I think the first one we start with is the original intention of hospital use, which was individual patients who had medical need, no access to treatments. There's absolutely no area of disagreement there whatsoever. We all agree essentially that that's a really key use of and the original purpose of hospital exemption. I think where we need to just have more discussion, and so I do appreciate the work you're doing. I think it is important to put a framework and a common understanding around what will be the other use of hospital exemption, which to actually basically provide products more generally outside of that original framework. I think it is important to define what that extra area will be. And I think if it is really going into essentially a competing supply for commercial patients, then it would be appropriate to have consistent standards and rigor of regulatory authorities. That doesn't mean to say that everything will be the same, because if you have different nature of manufacturing, some of the challenges are different, but the essential standards should be the same. The final point I will leave, which is controversial and worth another hour, is one of the main reasons that we're having this disagreement, though, is because of a bigger issue, which is actually kind of drawing us into this definition of hospital exemption, which is achieving better access within Europe, which will require, again, us as the industry, as academia, as the governments to actually get together to find ways in which we can have both different vehicles for actually making products available, and also ultimately different funding, because one of the challenges we've all recognized is because these are very expensive one-time medicines, you pay up front and later on you don't necessarily see the savings. And hospital exemption, the reason I think it's controversial, frankly, is because we haven't solved the second issue.
It's important to have collaboration for the sake of patients between academia and industry in development. It's also important not to have unfair and incorrect competition that would impact innovation. In the end, we want patients to have access today and access in the future to these medications. And I think all of us need to tackle those challenges in a constructive, collaborative way. And rest assured, hospital exemption, if anything else, gives a fantastic topic to keep these meetings going, right? I mean, so thank you. I apologize, but I felt I could not stop before one or two things were said. So enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.